ขอต้อนรับสำหรับฝ่ายเสนอก่อนนะคะมี2ท่านค่ะปรบมือให้กับน้องเพชรกิจชเอกชัยค่ะวันนี้มาลุคแคชชวลเลยนะสบายๆหลากสีด้วยวันนี้ และอีกหนึ่งท่านฝ่ายเสนอต้อนรับน้องพาเกตนิมมานเฮมินวันนี้มาเป็นฝ่ายเสนอเหรอ เปลี่ยนบ้างนะคะอ้าวฝ่ายค้านบ้างมี2ท่านเช่นกันนะคะต้อนรับฝ่ายค้านท่านแรกน้องสกลพัฒน์เอี่ยมเสมอค่ะและฝ่ายค้านท่านที่2นะคะต้อนรับน้องพัทรพลลิ้มสิริโสพลค่ะและแน่นอนปรบมือพลังให้กับผู้จัดการทีมคุณชาวิรุติจารุไพศาลกิจเชิญน้องชามค่ะ
สวัสดีครับทุกท่านผมนายนิรุติจรุภาษาอังกฤษหรือไทม์นะครับเป็นผู้จัดการทีมโต้สาระวาทีภาษาอังกฤษแห่งประเทศไทยหรือ Thailand National Debate Team ครับทีมนี้เป็นการรวมตัวของนักเรียนมัธยมจากทั่วประเทศทั้งจากโรงเรียนรัฐบาลเอกชนและนานาชาติครับทุกคนผ่านการคัดเลือกมาอย่างเข้มข้นเพื่อเป็นตัวแทนประเทศไทยในการแข่ง World School Debating Championship ซึ่งถือได้ว่าเป็นเวทีระดับโลกที่เทียบได้กับเป็นโอลิมปิกแห่งวงการโต้วาทีครับก่อนจะเริ่มผมขออธิบายกติกาสั้นๆสักนิดหนึ่งนะครับผู้พูดแต่ละคนจะมีเวลา8นาทีโดยพูดสลับกันระหว่างฝ่ายเสนอและฝ่ายค้านกฎพิเศษของวันนี้นิดนึงนะครับคือถึงแม้ว่าเราจะมีแค่ข้างละ2คนเราจะมีการซ้ำตัวละครเพื่อให้ได้ผู้สปีชละข้างละ3สปีชนะครับระหว่างการพูดคู่แข่งสามารถยืนขึ้นมากล่าวคำว่า point of information หรือ point เพื่อถามคำถามสั้นๆได้โดยผู้พูดสามารถเลือกที่จะรับหรือปฏิเสธคำถามนั้นก็ได้แต่โดยทั่วไปแล้วเราจะแนะนำให้รับประมาณ 1-2 คำถามเพราะมีผลต่อคะแนนนะครับวันนี้น้องๆจะมาจำลองการโต้วาทีหรือ exhibition debate ในหัวข้อ This how would give the youth a veto on economic policy that may affect the environment กล่าวคือเราจะให้เยาวชนทั้งหลายมีอำนาจในการวีโต้หรือปฏิเสธนโยบายเศรษฐกิจต่างๆที่ส่งผลต่อสิ่งแวดล้อมครับเพื่อไม่ให้ทันเสียเวลาขอเสียงตบมือให้กับนักโต้วาทีทั้ง4ท่านครับ Without further ado, I would like to invite the first proposition to open today's debate. Here.
The world that we're living in is at a crossroads. This is a time where many countries in the world and many international organizations are planning and charting the course for the future, especially in terms of environment. We see that the energy policies of the world has been disrupted so much by the Russian-Ukraine war, and every single country is now scrambling to have a plan for the future. We see many nuclear power plants all across the world are also going to be in retirement, and there will be new policies that have to become up in terms of energy. In terms of carbon and vehicles, we see that EVs are rising, and we have to decide whether to embrace it or not. We see that the time we live in right now will have effects and consequences 50, 60 years into the future, and right now we see that youths are being underrepresented. That is why we need a veto to counteract this. Couple things in setup then. Firstly, what does the veto system look like? We tell you that we'll let people from the ages of 18 to 30 participate in online voting. They will probably look like you having a policy on, you having a policy the government wants to pass, and then after all the processes of legislative processes, you go to the people and to the youth. And this is where the youth will decide whether or not this policy is going to go ahead. So with 50% or more of the youth deciding that a policy should not go ahead, then a policy would be vetoed and out of it. Second thing here is that what do we consider as an economic policy? We tell you that there are already third-party organizations that belong to the government, i.e. the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, and we say that every country is probably going to replicate this to create to create a neutral environmental agency to decide whether or not an act or a policy has environmental impact or not. But we say that we will tell these organizations to err on the side of caution if there is any suspicion, and there's any doubt that a policy might have an environmental impact, we would let them go to this council for the veto. First argument then on just why this is a justifiable action to do. Because we tell you the most economic policies that have an impact on environment usually has an impact a long time into the future. This looks like if you put out more carbon dioxide into the world right now, the world heating up by 0.1 degree a year isn't going to have that much of an impact this year, next year, in 10 years. It's probably going to accumulate itself over 10 and 20 years. Then in 50 years in the past, you have a world where half the world is uninhabitable because you're underwater, or the global temperature is too hot for you to even go outside. We say that the impact disproportionately affects the youth, and this is why they are the only actor that are affected by this debate. We tell you that in the status quo, when there is a problem that affects a certain group of people, we let that people have a veto. This looks like in the status quo, we have a public hearing system. For example, if I want to build like a new road on a certain area, people from the area who will be affected from the new road do have the right to veto, even if it's against the interest of the government or the interest of the collective. So we say this is such an extension of that. And we also tell you in terms of legislature, there are already many countries in the world who believes that if there is certain people who has certain like needs that are different from other people, we do give them extra votes. This looks like New Zealand giving extra votes or extra representation to the Maori minorities because they are going to be affected by some certain policies. And we say that this is a good principle to set, and that's why we're going to follow it. Before I move on, sure.
If this debate is about influencing the youth's future, how can the youth be 18 to 35 when they already have the ability to shape political narratives around them?
We tell you that if you look at the global population chart, there's a lot more old people in the status quo. We tell you that most politicians and most corporate leaders are already older people, and this is why they're underrepresented. And this leads me to my next argument then on why political participation is very important for the youth. Because we tell you that in the status quo, these youths are already being oppressed or underrepresented. This already, as I told you, looks like there's probably people who are in the process of making policies, are probably people who are older. And we tell you that in many parts of the world, even right now, there are age restrictions for like big political appointments. This already disenfranchises and make the youth unable to participate politically. This is why we need to compensate by making these policies. But we also tell you that there are also other informal barriers as to why these economic policies that will push us bad for the environment are still being pushed right now. Because we tell you the oil conglomerates or energy companies who produce the vast amount of pollution is the one that control a vast amount of the government. Why? Simply because they have most of the money in the world. We see that these companies are usually the richest companies in the country. You look at Gulf, you look at Shell, you look at Chevron. These companies do have lots of influence on the political system. This means that especially in most parts of the world where there's not a lot of big parties, these like oil conglomerates do have an incentive, are already infiltrating in these political parties. This means that there's actually no real choice for you to opt out of having a world that's run by people who have an incentive to pollute the world and profit out of it. But second thing here is that there is already a media narrative that affects people of older age for them to sway towards like voting for things that might not be environmentally sound. Why? For two reasons. Firstly, then on short-termism, because we tell you that like most people, especially when you're older, you don't have much more to live in life. Your life is going to be very short. You're probably not going to care a lot about like the world, the impact environment 50, 60 years down the line. You're probably going to care a lot more about like short-term things, and these things are going to be neglected. And we tell you that these people are the vast amount of the population right now just because of how little people are being born right now. But second thing here about the media narrative, because we tell you that big mainstream medias, like the big news corporations, are also being sponsored and funded by energy companies who have purpose like environmental incentives. This means that most people who watch like these mainstream media, which are usually going to be older people, are going to be affected to the point where they would probably vote for something short-term or something very economically oriented as opposed to something environment oriented. We tell tell you with all these informal barriers at play, it means that most young people don't really have a choice because anything they do in terms of like political action is probably going to be either voted down by people who are the majority or either going to be discarded by mainstream political parties who has no real incentive to cater to them. So we tell you that when a certain group has simply no real representation, they have no real representation, we need to arbitrarily find another way for them to get a representation. And we tell you a veto is the best way to do that. And last thing, I'll accept another POI.
In the same way that 30-year-olds do not get a veto over pension policies, even though it defines their retirement, what makes your case unique?
We tell you that we create a precedent. If we want them to have them a veto or like retirement, sure, they can have it. If any group or person is affected by a policy and they're uniquely affected, we shouldn't let the majority make the decision for them. We should put the like a veto power down to them. And we will agree that we will expand this to other things, but that's outside the scope of this debate then. But lastly then, just on the weighing of that, why is it that we agree that environmental issues should take precedence in all this discussion? One, we tell you that it's probably a lot more because like, you simply cannot consent to the long-term impact of environment because there's a lot of things that you don't know about the environment that can harm you. There might be certain aspects of like natural disasters that we have not unlocked yet that might happen if we keep down the road of polluting the world even more. And we say that because we cannot consent to these things happening and because the past we already have a record of being surprised by how bad environmental disasters could be, the government should err on the side of caution and protect these vulnerable people. So for all those reasons, that's why we tell you that we should give these people the right to veto government.
I thank the first proposition for the speech. Next, I would like to invite the first opposition to open opposition's case. Here.
The reality is, the most vulnerable people in the status quo was not the youth, but those who are poor, the working class, the farmers, or the coastal communities that exist because it was these people who experienced the extreme disaster and the extreme climate that exists right now. We think there is a sense of urgency for these people to be helped, and we, on opposition, we help these people. I'm gonna for 2 points of setup and 2 substantive then. First, on why the democratic decision is absolute, and second of all, why we get the overall benefit for the more political capital for these environmental issues then. First point of setup then, or what the veto also look like. I think we agree that it's very likely going to work by means selecting voting on certain a council or a policy by these kind of young and the youth that they want to talk about, right? But I think the thing to note here is that the vast majority of youth are politically apathetic and doesn't actually knows what they're talking about and what's the issue that is being discussed, right? Because especially when you look at your average teenager, they don't understand when you have to weigh up the economic issue that is ongoing right now or the environmental impact that is on long term. Meaning there's 3 implications of this. One, that you're likely to get low voter turnout for these kind of issue and these veto in the first place. So the legitimacy that exists is very low. But second of all, I think it doesn't actually reflect the view of the youth at the end of the day because they are unable to understand the technocratic matters on economic issue that actually and how it actually manifests in the world, right? It's effectively hard for these individuals to actually understand and like fully utilize the power that they exist for them, right? The second thing under this is that I think the idea of I think technically all policy affect environmental because every decision in terms of economic theory have a trade-off that is necessary. For example, when you put political capital into economic issue, you also lose out political capitals or the ability for you to tackle and funding into things like environmental policy or innovation exists. Meaning the line is very unclear of what actually is these kind of economic issue that affects these kind of environment. That even if they want to create this third-party organization, it's still unclear for them. That is extreme a lot of legal dispute that will happen. I'll explore later in my argument then. So first forward, the first substantive on why the democratic decision is an absolute one. Three things to note. One, I think how the state derives its legitimacy right now is that they give the ability to vote to people as a reparation because they limit the people agency in a lot of ways already. So things like the legislation or how tax itself is redistributed or policies that use monopoly of violence via the police force and the law itself. This means that I think there's an obligation to give people a vote and their ability to choose and extend their agency onto how the state works. Why then, in this case, all citizens deserve an equal say and no veto should be able to overturn things like this. There are three reasons. One, I think agency is equally limited by the current government of 4 years or how they actually limit your agency that exists. This means that they also owe a equally proportional reparation to all citizens that exist and live under their kind of power then. But second of all, I think it's unclear why objective harm exists for these youth, that even if they experience more on time scale wise, the intensity of it is still different and you still cannot weigh the utility of different lived experience of these people because it's technically unclear whether you can weigh up the long-term but low-intensity harm on the youth or the short-term but high-intensity harm of the people on the ground who are experiencing the extreme of climate change right now. Therefore, I think the conclusion is that I think it is perfectly fine to give voices equally to citizens insofar that it is subjective to the harm that is imposed on them, right? Meaning the harm is not unique to the youth, or at least not unique enough to give them a unique veto power to the entire population and the entire policy that exists. Before I go on, yes.
If a coal power plant was to be built next to your house, would you let the people in your village or the whole country to choose whether or not it goes ahead?
I think in terms of proximity, there's other actors that need to be involved, and in this instance, the other actor is also those who are the more vulnerable than these people. It was not a unilateral vote by the people that live near the coal plant, and this is the same way. We don't only allow the people of the youth to vote. We think it's an equal say of all people that we need to forward then. But the third idea under this is, I think the veto itself inflicts a third-party harm on other groups of society that exist and those who are economically also vulnerable and might be in need of those economic policy and the one who voted in those economic policy then. I think this looks like things like, for example, the agricultural support and subsidies for vulnerable farmers, which might be overturned by these kind of environmental youth projects because they see them as kind of environmentally harmful for the vast majority of cases, but then these farmers themselves starve and are unable to produce crops, or then structurally cannot get their own farms to work because they are unable to get these kind of things. I'll take another point, yes.
Name one policy that doesn't have a negative impact on anyone.
I think that is to say, our policy does necessarily have a trade-off, but I think the necessary decision to weigh the trade-off was up to the youth. The one who needs to weigh up the trade-off is the entire population and the citizen that the state derived its legitimacy from. That's the case we're proposing, not a unilateral leverage that the youth will have. I'll forward my second argument then on why we hope the entire political infrastructure for these economic issues then. Three things to note. One, I think it's already structurally unclear where the line is, whether the policy affect environmental or not, because we tell you already that basically all economic policy affect political opportunity costs for things like environment issues then. This means that the policy making itself become a legal dispute all the time. The implication of this is that one, it loses efficiency in terms of the implementation of policy, whether it's economic crisis themselves or the adaptation of environmental issues that you need to help the people or the youth themselves, right? But the second thing under this is that there's inherently backlash from other demographic of the democratic institution, right? Because they will resent when their democratic decision is overturned because you as an average worker, when you are not counted as the youth and you vote for a certain issue and then your decision got overturned, I don't think the people will likely going to be okay with it or like, that's fine for us. right? This means that it sparks things like the polarization within the political landscape or the anti-environment populist narrative that will emerge in a way that as a backlash for this entire political landscape then. The last thing to note under this is that state institutions and voters themselves will have a perception as illusion of change exists because they will see now as that you already give the people a veto as a mechanism to help the environment and protect the environment. So they'll vote and allocate fundings into other areas because they see this as enough change, or in a way, the enough political capital is already being spent on these environmental issues. And the reason this is harmful is that a veto can only stop policy that is already been implemented. But I think when you take this kind of political capital away, proposition you lose out on policies like carbon tax, emission cuts, or things that are positive for the environment, because these are unique things to the veto that exists, because a veto cannot implement new policy or one that objectively matter to the people, right? Meaning the conclusion of this, we prove two things. One, that in principle, it was legitimate for people to have an equal say in the political landscape. But second of all, we still help in terms of the political capital that exists for the environmental issue. I think for all of these reasons, opposition.
I thank the first opposition for the speech. Next, I would like to invite the second propositions to continue prop case. Here.
Side opposition has to defend the status quo with water rising, temperatures fluctuating, and natural disasters happening consistently. Because even though they say that there's progress happening, we say that it's not enough, because even though there's progress being made, there's policies happening that actively revoke and like take back that progress that happens and further harms the environment. And the only way to fix it in time for these youths is to give the youths who are already aware and who already cares about the environment to stop these harmful policies from happening in the first place. Two things I'll be doing in my speech. First of all, a few responses, then I'll be moving on to my extension about why we lead to a better environment and better policies happening, right? First of all, on their point about how young people don't know enough. But first of all, we already framed that it's 18 to 30 people, meaning they're the age of voting already, but it's also they're in college or in the working force already. But secondly, then these people are actually the people who know the most about the environment, as we see in the current status quo, with younger people having more and more aware of the environment than older peoples do. Second point then about how they lose capital and the illusion of change. First of all, we say that it doesn't matter anyways, because in the status quo, like for example, countries already have like a net goal that they have to meet to reduce O2, like carbon dioxide emission. But what's happening is that they want to revoke these things that are happening, meaning that, they can surpass that limits. And the impacts that we get from only just stopping these bad policies from happening are already changing the world. So even if there's no like helping to fund into it, if we're able to revoke and stop these bad policies from happening, then we already help the world and already make the environment better in the first place then. Thirdly, on the point of their principle about how it's like other people, first of all, we say that the environment disproportionately affects the youth, right? Because environments are stuff that's going to be happening and affecting in the future. It might not be clear now, but for example, if temperatures are rising at 1 degree every year, 10 degrees into the future, these youths are going to be the ones affecting. And it's unfair to let everyone decide because they're not the people affected, right? And it's even worse when in the status quo, they have even, like the youth doesn't even have the real choice of deciding that. This looks like, for example, like an older society happening, or like older people being able to control the media and being able to like influence votes more. That's why these youths don't even get like a real choice of deciding that. And that's why it's even more important to have them let this choice of what affects them the most, because these are the people who are going to be affected. And that's why we have to give them more votes then. Fourthly then, on the fact of other factors and groups, we say that first of all, it doesn't matter because obviously there's going to be harms to every every policy is being made, but then we'll bite that bullet then, because all of these people are going to be affected by global warming or like environmental harms anyways. This looks like, for example, agriculture also experiencing like bad profits if like there's a lot of natural disasters happening, and also like on their point of poor or like unlike privileged people, these people are the people who are going to be the most affected by natural disasters. So by giving the votes, the youth, the vetoes to stop these policies and stop the environment from being worse, we're also helping these people and giving them a better life in turn as well then. Moving on to my extension about why we get better policies and why we get better environments then. Because first of all, you have to know that the youth they know and are aware of the environment the most and the environmental problems the most. We see that in the status quo. But they're also the ones who care the most because they have to live with this afterwards, meaning that they'll likely make decisions that like better for the environment because it also affects them, right? And they're able to veto the policies that harms the environment. This looks like, for example, creating oil diggings or like revoking people having to like have a certain like countries having like a certain carbon dioxide release. This just harms the environment in general. And this is very, very highly probable because in the status quo, we see that youth people are just more aware in general and they're more prominent especially with the prominent rise of social media, being able to spread more information easily, right? This leads to making better policies in the first place, right? Because if the youths have the power to veto these, this looks like government officials creating better policies in the first place because they just don't want it to they just don't want the veto to happening, making them like create a better policies for the environment in the first place and not making policies that harms the environment, right? But secondly, then it also leads to more awareness, like both adults and the youths. Adults learning more because now there's a platform for the youths to like be able to say and stop stuff, but also among youths to be able to know more about the environment, but also the politics as well. And there is an urgency to this, right? Because in the status quo, we see that the world is getting worse by the day, and this is the only way to stop this, because we see that currently most older people are the ones controlling the media narratives on television, but there's also people less people being born and more into an older society, meaning that the votes that the youth have in the status quo is not enough. Plus, even more spreads of right-wing agenda leading to more and more harmfuls, and the youth not actually having the choice. This is the only way to give the youth power, and basically giving the youth power to be able them to stop these policies from happening that directly affects them. But it's also in the status quo, slowly making people informed or just other ways just simply won't work because it's just not in time. Because the urgency of this happening is very high. That's why it's very hard to do in favor of the world, and that's why we have to give them the veto to stop that. But before I move on, is there any POIs? Okay, moving on then. So at the end of the basis then, so even if there's no better policies, or if the awareness is still the same, we still think if we're able to reject the bad policies from happening, this looks like policies revoking stuff not being able to persist anymore. We say that just simply doing nothing to the earth will slowly revive and do better itself, leading to better environment and better global better global in general, leading to them being the earth being able to revive and come form again. So even if there's nothing that actually is better, just us from stopping these things are actually already making the world better. And it also sets a good precedence, for example, other future topics like feminism or minorities, giving them to veto on stuff that directly affects them, because these are the people who are most affected, and that's why we should give them the votes to be able to create better policies and better environment for their own future lives in the future. Therefore, never been prouder to oppose. Thank you. Propose.
I thank the second propositions for the speech. Next, I would like to invite the second opposition to continue Op's case. Here.
Government's rhetoric is what exactly kills them in this round. From the moment PM dropped the line that the youth in this debate is 18 to 35, we think that the ballot has already been sealed for opposition's side of the House. Because if it is indeed true that this debate is about influencing the youth's future, how can the youth be 18 to 35 when this demographic of age already have the capacity to vote for different politicians, have the ability to shape political narratives around them, and control the opinions of different people around them? We think that if we were to talk about individuals where policies would actually affect their future. We have to talk about those individuals below the age of 18 who their parents still have their control over them. We're so proud to oppose. Few things I'll be doing in my speech. I will be responding to their case and having this extension on why choice doesn't really exist on government side of the House. But first, I want to follow up this POI PM gave to AO in this debate. The POI we got was simple. Name one policy that isn't negative or doesn't have like any negative like downturns. That is the exact problem on proposition side of the House in this debate, right? Because we think that consequences are inevitable at the end of the day. Consequences will always happen, no matter the policy you push for. And given that children aren't accountable, that is the exact reason that children should not have a say in these policies on your side of the House, right? Responding to their case, the first thing I would like to respond to is talk about why their entire motto is simply flawed. The motto we got from their side of the House was that it's probably going to be an online version of a referendum where children get to vote, especially those individuals who are most affected by environmental issues in the status quo, right? I have two responses to take this out of the debate. Firstly, on accessibility. If it is indeed true that the main concern in this debate are about the most impoverished on the ground, would they even have access to these websites in the very first place or not? But secondly then, we literally told you that these economic policies are incredibly complicated, right? It isn't just one simple fiscal policy that we're going to implement. Different policies play with each other. Different policies synthesize with each other in order to create one economic consequence, right? And therefore, we think that given that children do not have the capacity to differentiate these nuances between these policies, and given that the referendum on their side of the House is probably just going to be a yes or no, we think that this is really, really problematic on their side of the House, given that incredibly subjective topics like economics cannot be reduced to just a yes or no in this debate. Sure.
If they are that naive and unable to think, why do you even let them vote in the very first place?
It's not necessarily that children are stupid, but it's the fact that they do not have political accountability, even though it is the case that consequences will happen inevitably, right? On to the second thing I would like to respond to is about representation. And I don't know what representation do they want in the very first place, given that this debate is about economic policies with environmental consequences, not environmental policies with economic consequences. And there is a really, really clear distinction here. We are talking about monetary and fiscal policies. We're talking about taxation, etc. that children have nothing to do about in the very first place. So we just don't understand what children have to do with this. And I just want to give a really simple piece of weighing, right, on why this case does not really matter coming from their side of the House. Given that the demographic of youth is probably so small anyways, their voices are probably going to be outweighed on their side of the House, and their political opinions, or like what they believe politically, is probably not going to be translated into real policies anyways. Onto this extension on why choice doesn't really exist on their side of the House. Kapan already told you that with great power comes great responsibility. Children do not deserve the ability to veto these policies given that they do not have any sort of accountability in the very first place. But let's take a step back and talk about why you probably don't even have that choice on proposition side of the House in the very first place. I want to break down this argument into two levels so it's probably easier for us to digest. On the first level, and I just want to make it really clear that we live in a country where we are already probably going to argue with our parents when we bring up politics on the kitchen table. Let's say, for example, if you grew up in a conservative family and you believe in relatively democratic or relatively moderate ideologies, your parents are probably going to disagree with you. You're probably going to have a fight with them every single dinner. What will likely happen under their side of the House then? We think that children are going to be coerced in order to push for certain policies, given that different economic policies reflect different political standpoints, right? Because let's say, for example, if you come from a communist standpoint, your parents are probably going to want to abolish private sectors, but if you grow up in a socialist family, your parents are probably going to have a more affinity for the idea of regulating markets more moderately, right? We think that there are always always political philosophies and all of these political ideologies reflected behind these economic policies on their side of the house. And it is really likely the case that your parents are probably going to coerce you to vote for different policies. Why is this the case then? Because your parents are probably going to tell you that since you're so grown up and since you have your own ideas, since you insist so much in what you believe, why not you leave my house and go have your own opinions? And this might not be true, right? But these are threats that are really, really real and already used in the status quo. And they're going to perpetuate a vicious cycle on your side of the house. Why then? Because of the fact that your entire life, your decisions have been controlled by your parents. And now that you become the grown-ups of the next generation, you're probably going to do the same with the youth of that generation since you have been longing for that policy for so long. On to the second layer of this argument on why you probably don't really have a choice. We argue that the future is uncertain, especially with green technology, right? Historically speaking, we never knew that we were going to have air purifiers until we actually lived in the status quo. We never know that we are going to have like all of these amazing inventions until we actually live at this point in time. And therefore, because of the fact that you can't really predict the future, especially with the environment or even with the economy, we think that on your side of the house, you don't actually have a choice here. We think that this choice is really important. And why is it exclusive under our side of the house? We think that it is exclusive under our side of the house because you get to make that decision at the point in time where those consequences are already proximate to you. You're probably going to like be more happy with like the policies that are implemented because it is already proximate to you at that point in time. And we think that it was only under our side of the house where we get a better democratic system, where we get more transparency. But crucially, children actually get a vote in what they say when it actually matters to them. And for all of these reasons, I'm so proud to oppose.
I thank the second opposition for the speech. Next, I would like to invite the third proposition to summarize Prop's case. Here.
I don't know why, but opposition believes that you should tackle a problem when the consequences is already there. They already missed what we already told you in from PM, that most of the problems are very urgent, are probably common right now, that will have consequences long into the future. But we also give you the nuance that most of the impact is going to be manifesting in the future. Panel, we simply can't wait for the whole country to be under flood and under the sea before we decide on a carbon policy that will help cool down the world. I think that's going to be a lot too late, far too late. I will tell you that on our side of the house is the only way that we tackle this urgency. Two clashes in the debate then. Firstly then on, is this a legitimate thing for the government to do? Because on their side of the house, they believe that because the youth already have a choice and that's already enough. This argument basically ignores what I've told you in first, that there are indirect barriers to entry of youth, of ideas of the youth in general. We told you there's a media narrative that exists in the status quo that's been propagated by big media companies and by big energy corporations that are very anti-environment, are just very profit incentivized. We tell you that with this prevailing media narrative and also this narrative affecting the political system, there's actually no real choice the youth can choose when they want to decide on the course of the environmental policies in their own country. Just because they fail to engage on how they provide another alternate source of choice, they simply fail. Because on their model, they simply say that because you can vote, it means that you already have the representation. We already told you that you are the only actor that's going to have substantial impact upon you. And in the normal democracy system, if you do not have the majority of the population, you cannot force anything to be done. But on their side of the house, they try to prove to you that because there are other actors who are affected, that's why the other actors who are affected, that's why we have to let everyone vote. But we tell you that other actors like farmers, like other actors that are going to be affected by these bills are already being represented greatly in most societies. Because we tell you that most of the people, the most popular job in the world right now are literally farmers. They have an option, unlike the youth who are just a minority of the population. But also remember that most of the youth are simply cannot even vote. It's like people like us who are under the age of 18. But we also tell you that for people like us at the age of 18, it's probably very likely that we fear the consequences long term, and that's why it is a legitimate thing for the state to do, to give us the choice, not the state to do, to give our choice to other people who are most proximate to us. This is just giving votes from people under the age of 18 to people who in the youth that are on the side of government, we tell you can have the right to the veto. That means that in our world, these people do actually have a choice, unlike in the status quo, where there's actually an illusion of choice in the status quo. Because sure, you can go vote for a political party that claims to help the environment, but go look at who they are sponsored by, go look at the past track records, go look at what the world is currently going right now. Because we tell you since first that the world right now is very economically minded. There's already a lot of bias towards short-termism, and economic things are very, very short-termist. We told you that most policies care about environment a lot more than they care about economy, a lot more than they care about the environment. So we need OpWeb to come up and tell us on why there is an actual choice and an actual way for these youth to get representation, or else they just lose this debate. But second thing here is that we tell you that it's also very legitimate if a policy affects the youth and the youth only. Why is it that the youth is going to be affected more? As I already told you in first, that these environmental problems are very long-termist in nature. Global the global carbon dioxide increases on a small margin, but over time it accumulates. This looks like in 100 years, a lot of the world is going to be underwater. It's probably not going to be underwater in 10, 20 years, which most adults will probably die before that anyways. So we tell you that when these actors are uniquely affected, but even if there are impacts on other individuals, we tell you the impact is not probably big enough to be life-changing. But for these younger people, it is life-changing. That's why we have to ask them. As I told you, this is the same thing as when you were trying to build a road or something near an area. You don't ask the whole country whether or not they like this road or not. You ask the people around them, are they okay with the pollution, or are they okay with what's happening in the current area. We tell you the most proximate actor is probably the actor who knows best what to do with their lives, and we simply can't sacrifice these people for the sake of the majorities, for the sake of the majority wants and the majority utility. So we tell you this is a legitimate thing to do. Before I move on to my second clash, any POI?
This debate is about economic policies with environmental effects, not environmental policies in a vacuum. Why do children below the age of 18 matter when they probably don't even have a source of income?
Simply because they are affected by environmental problems. We allow people who don't drive cars and live in the area where they're building a new road to have a say on whether or not that road should be built or not. This doesn't matter on the point of the economy, because if you are affected by this policy and you're affected in terms of environment, you should have the right to say. Second thing here, and then on the practical clash, because side government brings up a very interesting argument on just the illusion of change, and there'll be no more political capital to advance the environmental agenda any further. We tell you that we accept that trade-off, and it's fine for us to not have any more environmental laws, because simply in the status quo, there's already enough laws right now. This looks like most countries in the world are already committing to net zero, but we tell you the problem is most countries are opting out of it. And we tell you that the consequences of opting out of net zero is probably going to be bigger than any other policy, because these are structural binding laws that were written in the past that binds countries to not produce any more carbon dioxide. That alone outweighs whatever new things are going to happen. And we tell you there are many of these commitments already made in the past. You look at the Paris Climate Accord that Trump wants to lead so much. We tell you if we don't leave these things, it's probably going to be better than any policy that comes up. But second thing here is that we tell you that the policy on our side of the house is going to be better. Because think about it. If you are a government, do you want to live in a world where simply every of your bills is going to be vetoed away and you're going to be able to do nothing? No, these political parties will need to adapt and will need to change to make their policies palatable to people who care a lot about the environment, for this policy to have consideration about the environment. And we tell you that when we have these sort of policies, it's probably going to outweigh all the capital that they say in their world. They simply just fail to tell us on what it actually looks like, what new policy that we're going to miss out on. And then lastly then, on the weighing of why do we actually care about the environment a lot more than the economy, because even if we assume the best case that we tank the economy, we tell you there's simply no need to have a good economy where every farmer is prospering when in 50, 60 years, everyone's going to be starved because all the farmland is flooded away, and when all you can't any grow any crops because it's getting too hot, and people can't even live in the world right now. So we tell you for these reasons that environmental policy should be prioritized, even if it's illegitimate, even if it compromises other people, because simply in the long term, it has like a lot more consequences and outweighs everything here. And then lastly, then we also tell you that when we fix the biggest problem right now is that because democracy is not functioning as a democracy, it's not the state right now, it's not legitimate because you take away agencies from youth, but you don't actually give them the option to choose. This looks like you're getting money from the youth through taxation, but most of the policies don't even care about them, especially in terms of the environment, where their tax money goes to doesn't really synchronize with what their beliefs are, just simply because, as I told you, how screwed the political system is right now. So for all those reasons, we give these people actual meaningful choice as opposed to fake choice on their word proposition.
I thank the third proposition for the speech. Next, I would like to invite the third op to summarize today's debate. Here.
วิบอีกแล้วโอเค I think no choices or action is objectively better than others insofar that there's different lived experience of all individual. We all have different life, and we want to say that this unique harm that can never be summed up. The only burden of proposition here is to prove that the environmental harm is one, unique, but two, objective to these use. So the first thing I'm going to talk about then in my speech is that whether these kind of objective and unique harm, even if it exists in the first place, right? Because I think it's structurally unclear why it exists for these group of people that are unique, that the harm is unique to only the youth that already exists, right? First thing then, on who actually suffer the most from this climate change issue, even if on the long term then. We think climate vulnerability is not evenly distributed, yes we agree, but it was not unique to the youth. We already point out to more vulnerable group of people, like those farmers or those low-income households who cannot sustain themselves because of more extreme climates, whether it's flooding or rising temperature, that their own agricultural system collapsed and they don't have income for these kind of things. These kind of impact hit right now and not decades later. I think there's urgency and an obligation that exists. For example, if the youth veto things like fertilizer subsidies for the environmental reason, farmers starve and then prices rise and now people cannot afford these things that exist. And I think the implication of this is that the harm was not unique and therefore there was a no direct proportional ability for them to veto the entire people's decision to make this policy or push out of its ability to be implemented in the first place. Then I'll have one big response and then to my two flash then. One, I think proposition claims that the youth is structurally locked out from politics because of media and mainstream stuff. Two response. One, we think even if this is true, the lack of influences doesn't still justify breaking the democratic decision of the people insofar that it's still the fact that the crux of the democratic institution is still that you give the choice to people, and that in a way, that choice have to be decided by the general people because there's in no way possible that you know better than the actor themselves and what lived experience of them reflected and what is needed for them to actually live their lives and what matter more to them. I'll take a point before I go on.
I told you since first, if there are other groups who are underrepresented, we're fine to give them a veto too.
We're also fine giving a veto. We think if giving veto to all those people, I think it summarizes into giving the entire population an equal say at the end of the day, right? Because if every single action affect different unique group of actor, then you give a unique veto to everyone. And I think it's just a deadlock of every policy because every policy have trades-off. They say so themselves. So when like an environmental issue and an environment policy come out, the economic sector just gonna veto it anyway. So I think the deadlock exists under their world. If they're likely going to defend that, I think the world is way worse then. I'll go to my two clash then. First, on principle, whether it's legitimate or not, and second, on top of the practicality, whether the manifestation of it is actually beneficial for the people then. First, on principle, I'm going to clear up things on third-party harm that exists, right? Because I don't think the right to choice and the right to veto some things need to be proximate to an actor and doesn't exist a third-party harm that exists that they can overturn and then overturn and veto these decisions then. Because when we tell you, for example, when the youth reject things like energy subsidies, urban poors are also locked out from things like transportation prices because those things rise as a response to the failing economies or the inability of the state to structurally support these kind of systems, even if there is a small environmental trade-off that exists for these people, right? When people vote in these things, I think it matters for them to be implemented because then you are giving these youth an overturning ability that is already extended over their extended over their choice, which already exists in the kind of the normal political landscape, which they already can vote for policy that they think matter more, especially when they point out to people, according to them, like 18 to 30s, I think these people already hold a lot of influences within the political landscape already, insofar that these demographics are also a lot of society already exists, because these are the working class in the view of society anyway, so a say exists for them, and they can already vote within the system itself. So I think the conclusion and the principle is two things. One, I think it exists a third-party harm under these kind of vetoing system. So I think the right to veto exists and approximate enough to these youth to vote on them. But second of all, the harm is not unique to only this group of actors. And even if so, when they want to extend the veto to all groups, I don't think it's clear that that's also possible within the kind of the political landscape that already exists then. That given, second clash then on practical, there's three things to note. One, we are talking about the insane amount of political deadlock that will exist, even if so, because economic policy itself will always have a certain impact, even if you want to build a hospital or when you tax something, you take away the ability for you to put funding or like implement those issues into things like environmental issue, or even when you want to do construction that exists, there's an inherent harm into the environment or the atmosphere that exists around the area, right? So there's two implications of this. One, I think they lower the efficiency of all policies that came out because there's going to be active legal dispute that exists. Even things like climate adaptation itself that needs fundings and the economic policy that kind of recruit funding and is prerequisite to these things slow down because they are unable to get these things into action fast and help the most vulnerable then. The second thing under this clash is that I think the idea of political capital is insanely restricted in the status quo already, insofar that in the vast majority of cases, there's an urgency on other issues, because when people don't have food on the table, people already vote for things like economic issues that exist, or even for things like health infrastructure. There's more active incentive for people to look at those things and vote for these things. Meaning when you give this illusion of change and then you give this veto power as a mechanism for you to protect the environment, it's still unclear why you don't take these kind of political capital from other areas and other policies that also matter much more and are more direct to this environment in a positive notion then. I'll take a point.
I already gave you the weighing that the government can do nothing in terms of the environment. It's probably going to be better than the counterfactual on op.
I think the people's choice still matter, and that is what we're supporting under our side of the house, or what the people choose, and that is what being implemented under our side of the house then. So the last thing I'm going to talk about then is whether the system itself of veto exists effectively for the youth to opt into. So I think the first thing proposition claimed here is that around the age they want to talk about, these people know best about the environmental issue already. So the question here is why then is it not enough for them to express it in the existing democratic institution already? So it is structurally unclear why it's not enough, or even if when they know the best, they have the advocacy and the rise of these movements that already exist within the status quo then. But the second thing under this, I think we also point out that the vast majority of youth doesn't understand the technocratic matters of economic policy and its manifestation. Even if you look around the world, there was a rise of populist narrative that already exists for these youths, meaning they won't likely understand these kind of policy in the first place, and even if so, it was still in a way that's not reflect the youth as a whole, because it was still those who are elite enough or care enough about the environment for you to vote and opt into these kind of vetoing system in the first place. So I think for all of those reasons, opposition.
I thank the third opposition for the speech. ขอบคุณน้องๆและสำหรับการโต้วาทีที่เข้มข้นแล้วเต็มไปด้วยพลังและความคิดสร้างสรรค์นะครับสิ่งที่เราได้ฟังไปเมื่อสักครู่เป็นมากกว่าคำตอบตายตัวว่าใครถูกหรือผิดเป็นมากกว่าผลแพ้ชนะว่ามุมมองไหนดีกว่ากันแต่เป็นการชวนให้เราคิดตั้งคำถามต่อว่าเรื่องนี้มันมีมุมอื่นอีกหรือเปล่าที่น้องๆอาจจะยังไม่ได้ cover อำนาจในการปฏิเสธอำนาจในการวีโต้ของเยาวชนเนี่ยมีผลอื่นๆอีกไหมนะครับเป็นการมองปัญหาจากหลายมิติไม่ว่าจะเป็นเชิงสังคมเชิงหลักการหรือเชิงพาณิชย์ที่ต่อยอดได้ขึ้นไปสุดท้ายนี้นะครับหากทุกท่านอยากร่วมสนับสนุนน้องๆ Thailand National Debate Team เพื่อให้มีโอกาสไปสร้างชื่อเสียงในเวทีโลกเรามีเสื้อทีมรุ่นพิเศษนะครับเหมือนที่ผมใส่อยู่ในวันนี้จัดทำขึ้นรายได้ทั้งหมดเนี่ยจะนำไปสนับสนุนกิจกรรมและการฝึกซ้อมของน้องๆครับทุกท่านสามารถเลือกซื้อได้ง่ายๆผ่าน QR code ที่ลิงก์ไปที่ Instagram Page ของพวกเรานะครับ Thailand National Debate Team หรือด้านโต๊ะที่โต๊ะด้านข้างเวทีได้เลยครับขอเสียงตบมืออีกครั้งให้กับทีมโต้สาระวาทีภาษาอังกฤษแห่งประเทศไทยครับ
ขอบคุณน้องๆและก็ผู้จัดการทีมด้วยนะคะโอกาสนี้ขออนุญาตเชิญทุกท่านถ่ายภาพร่วมกันอีกครั้งหนึ่งแล้วก็ขอเชิญโค้ชพราวตานะคะผู้ฝึกซ้อมฝึกสอนเขี่ยวเข็นเด็กๆนะคะวันนี้ซึ่งนี่คือระดับมัธยมศึกษาตอนปลายที่มีความสามารถแต่กว่าจะได้วันนี้มาต้องแลกกับการฝึกซ้อมฝึกฝนในการเรียนรู้ใฝ่หาความรู้ต่างๆให้เกิดระดับสกิลที่เรียกได้ว่าสามารถแข่งขันระดับโลกได้นะคะทุกคนปรบมือให้กำลังใจสำหรับทุกท่านด้วยนะคะเราหวังว่าแข่งขันเดือนหน้านะที่เตรียมอุดมน้องๆทุกคนจะทำได้ดีที่สุดนะคะโอกาสนี้ค่ะขออนุญาตเรียนเชิญดร.เอกพล ณ สงขลาท่านรองผู้จัดการใหญ่ฝ่ายทรัพยากรบุคคลบริษัทไทยกรุ๊ปโฮลดิ้งนะคะให้เกียรติมอบของที่ระลึกแด่ผู้จัดการทีมโค้ชพราวตารวมถึงน้องๆเด็กๆเยาวชนทีมชาติไทยเป็นกำลังใจให้น้องๆนะคะกับการแข่งขันทุกๆสเตจเลยแล้วก็เรียนเชิญท่านเอกพลนะคะอยู่ต่อถ่ายภาพร่วมกันกับน้องๆกับ Thailand National Debate Team ปรบมือหน่อยค่ะขอบพระคุณค่ะขอบพระคุณดร.เอกพลขอบคุณนะคะแต่เดี๋ยวน้องทามกับน้องโค้ชแพรวตาอยู่บนเวทีก่อนนะหลังจากภาพนี้อันนี้คือสัญลักษณ์นะคะของงานของเรา SX 2025 ขอบพระคุณดร.เอกพลนะคะขอบพระคุณค่ะ